In 1989, 4 flight attendants disappeared on Christmas Eve after landing at Denver International's predecessor, Stapleton Airport. Their abandoned car was found running in the employee parking lot, doors open, purses inside. No bodies were ever discovered, no ransom demanded, no trace found. But 35 years later, a demolition crew tearing down an old aircraft hangar would uncover something that proved the women never left the airport at all. And what happened to them in those final hours would reveal a nightmare that had been hiding in plain sight for over 3 decades. If you're fascinated by true mysteries and cold cases that refuse to stay buried, subscribe and follow along as we uncover the truth. The snow fell in thick curtains across the Denver tarmac that Christmas Eve, 1989. Inside Stapleton Airport's Terminal B, travelers rushed through the concourses, desperate to reach their destinations before the storm worsened. Gate agents made hurried announcements about delays and cancellations, while children pressed their faces against the windows, watching the ground crews work in the mounting drifts. Flight 447 from Los Angeles touched down at 9:47 p.m., nearly 2 hours behind schedule. The passengers deplaned with visible relief, grateful to have landed safely before the weather closed the airport entirely. 4 flight attendants gathered their belongings from the overhead compartments in the empty cabin, their cheerful professionalism giving way to exhaustion. Jennifer Parcell, 32, the senior attendant, checked her watch and sighed. Her 2 young children would already be asleep at her mother's house. She had promised to be home by 10. Diane Rothman, 28, gathered scattered magazines from the seat pockets, her engagement ring catching the cabin lights. Her fiancé was waiting at her apartment with Chinese takeout and a Christmas movie. Kelly Ashford, 26, the youngest of the crew, hummed along to the terminal music piping through the aircraft speakers. This was her first Christmas working for the airline, and she had plans to meet friends at a bar in Capitol Hill. Stacy Morrison, 31, silent and methodical, checked the lavatories one final time. She lived alone and had no particular plans for the evening, which suited her fine. She preferred solitude. They descended the jet bridge together, laughing about a difficult passenger who had complained about everything from the temperature to the ice cubes. The terminal was quieter than usual. Most flights already departed or canceled. Their footsteps echoed through the nearly empty concourse as they made their way toward the crew room to change out of their uniforms. Security footage would later show them entering the crew facilities at 10:04 p.m. They emerged 23 minutes later in civilian clothes, carrying their overnight bags, still talking and laughing. The camera tracked them through the terminal, past shuttered shops and dark gates, until they exited through the employee entrance at 10:31 p.m. That was the last confirmed sighting of Jennifer Parcell, Diane Rothman, Kelly Ashford, and Stacy Morrison. At 11:47 p.m., an airport maintenance worker discovered Jennifer's white Honda Accord idling in the employee parking lot. Driver's door hanging open, engine running, headlights cutting through the falling snow. The other 3 doors were also open. 4 purses sat on the seats. 4 pairs of shoes were scattered on the pavement beside the vehicle, as if the women had stepped out of them and simply walked away into the storm. The Denver Police Department launched an immediate investigation. Search dogs tracked scents to the edge of the parking lot, then lost them. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging scoured the surrounding areas once the storm passed. Divers searched nearby retention ponds. Volunteers combed through fields and construction sites. Nothing was found. In the days that followed, investigators discovered that none of the women had accessed their bank accounts. Their credit cards went unused. Their apartments remained undisturbed, Christmas presents still wrapped beneath their trees. Their families received no calls, no letters, no signs of life. The case consumed local media for months, then faded as leads evaporated, and other tragedies claimed headlines. The families held vigils every Christmas Eve, their numbers dwindling as years became decades. The investigation remained officially open but dormant, filed away in a basement archive alongside thousands of other cold cases. Until a December morning in 2024, when a construction foreman named Dale Hutchins made a discovery that would finally answer the question that had haunted Denver for 35 years. What happened to the 4 flight attendants who vanished on Christmas? The hydraulic excavator's steel teeth bit into the corrugated metal siding of Hangar 7, one of the last remaining structures from the old Stapleton Airport. Dale Hutchins stood 50 feet away, clipboard in hand, watching his crew systematically dismantle the building that had stood vacant since the airport's closure in 1995. The December wind cut through his jacket, carrying the metallic screech of tearing metal across the abandoned tarmac. Stapleton had been dead for nearly 3 decades, its runways broken up, its terminals converted into community buildings or demolished entirely. This hangar, located on the far eastern edge of the former airport grounds, had escaped destruction only because of its remote location and the bureaucratic tangles surrounding the land's redevelopment. Now, finally, it was scheduled to become part of a new commercial complex. Dale had been supervising demolition projects for 22 years. He had torn down factories, apartment buildings, even an old prison. He approached each job with the same methodical attention to detail, ensuring his crew followed safety protocols and environmental regulations. Hangar 7 should have been straightforward, just another empty building coming down to make room for progress. The excavator pulled away a large section of the hangar's western wall, exposing the dark interior. Dale's foreman, Marcus Webb, waved from the machine's cab, signaling a pause while they assessed the newly opened space. Standard procedure required checking for structural instability before proceeding. Dale walked toward the opening, pulling a flashlight from his belt. The winter sun hung low in the pale sky, offering little illumination for the hangar's depths. As he approached the jagged gap in the wall, a peculiar smell reached him, faint but distinct beneath the scents of rust and old concrete. Something organic, long degraded. He stepped through the opening carefully, his boots crunching on debris. The hangar stretched away into shadow, vast and empty except for some abandoned equipment near the far end. The building had been used for maintenance storage in its final years, and forgotten items still littered the space. Old toolboxes, coils of wire, a few rusted engine parts. Dale swept his flashlight across the interior, the beam cutting through decades of accumulated dust. The floor was concrete, cracked and stained with oil. Support columns rose at regular intervals, their paint peeling. Nothing seemed unusual until his light found the northwestern corner. There, partially obscured by a collapsed shelving unit, was what appeared to be a small office or storage room built into the hangar's corner. The door hung crooked on broken hinges. Dale approached it slowly, the smell growing stronger with each step. Not overwhelming, but unmistakable to anyone who had worked around old buildings. The scent of decay, muted by time but still present. He reached the door and pushed it open with his foot. The hinges screamed in protest. His flashlight beam swept into the small room, perhaps 10 feet by 10 feet, windowless and dark. 4 chairs sat in the center of the room, arranged in a small circle. 4 skeletons occupied those chairs. Dale stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. The skeletons sat upright, held in place by what appeared to be wire or cord wrapped around their torsos and the chair backs. Their skulls faced inward, toward the center of the circle, as if they had been positioned to look at each other. Tattered remnants of clothing still clung to the bones, the polyester fabric of what might have been airline uniforms. At the feet of each skeleton lay a pair of women's shoes. Dale backed away slowly, his training overriding the shock. He had found bodies on demolition sites before, though usually single individuals who had sought shelter in abandoned buildings. This was different. This was deliberate. This was a crime scene that had been waiting 35 years to be discovered. He returned to the opening and called out to Marcus, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The excavator's engine died, and, in the sudden silence, Dale made the call to the Denver Police Department. Within 40 minutes, the site was cordoned off. Police vehicles lined the access road, their lights flashing against the gray December sky. Detectives moved through the hangar in protective suits, their flashlights creating a strange ballet of crossing beams in the darkness. Detective Sarah Chen stood in the doorway of the small room, studying the scene before her. She was 41, with 17 years in the Denver PD, the last 8 in homicide. She had seen her share of disturbed crime scenes, but something about this one sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. The positioning was too deliberate, too theatrical. Someone had arranged these women, placed them in this circle, left them here to rot in the darkness. The room showed no signs of forced entry from the outside, no indication that the victims had tried to escape. The door had been locked from the outside, the padlock still hanging from the hasp, though rust had weakened it enough that the door had eventually sagged open. Her partner, Detective Raymond Cole, appeared beside her. He was 53, a veteran who had worked the original missing persons case back in 1989 when he was a young patrol officer. He had been one of the first responders to the abandoned car in the employee parking lot. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice carefully controlled. "The coroner's preliminary assessment says female, likely Caucasian, based on skeletal markers. 4 individuals. Approximate age range 25 to 35. She turned to look at him, noting the pallor of his face. "You're thinking about the flight attendants." Raymond nodded slowly. "The shoes. 4 pairs of women's shoes, just like we found in the parking lot." Sarah had studied the case file after Raymond mentioned it during the drive to the site. The disappearance of Jennifer Parcell, Diane Rothman, Kelly Ashford, and Stacy Morrison had been one of Denver's most baffling mysteries. The abandoned car, with its running engine and open doors, had suggested abduction, but the lack of any physical evidence, any witnesses, any trace of the women had left investigators with nothing but theories. "The hangar was operational in 1989, Raymond continued. "This section was used for maintenance equipment storage. There would have been people working here regularly." "Until when?" Sarah asked. "Airport closed in 95. After that, the building was mostly abandoned." Raymond moved closer to the doorway, careful not to contaminate the scene. Someone had access, someone who worked here or knew the layout well enough to find this room. The forensic team worked through the night, documenting every detail of the grim discovery. Powerful lights on tripods illuminated the small room, casting harsh shadows that made the scene even more macabre. Photographers captured the positioning of the skeletons from every angle, while technicians carefully cataloged the items scattered around the chairs. Sarah stood outside the room, reviewing the initial findings on her tablet. The shoes had been identified as common brands from the late 1980s. Remnants of fabric clinging to the bones showed traces of navy blue and red polyester, consistent with airline uniforms from that era. Most disturbing was the wire wrapped around each skeleton, binding them to the chairs. It was standard aircraft safety wire, the type used in airplane maintenance. Dr. Patricia Vance, the chief medical examiner, emerged from the room, pulling down her mask. She was a woman in her late 50s with steel-gray hair and eyes that had witnessed 3 decades of death in its many forms. She had learned long ago to maintain professional distance, but even she seemed shaken by what lay in that room. "Initial observations," she said, consulting her notes. 4 adult females, skeletal remains consistent with 30 to 35 years of decomposition in this environment. No obvious trauma to the bones themselves, no fractures, no bullet holes. The wire bindings were applied peri-mortem or shortly post-mortem. I'll know more after the autopsy. "Cause of death?" Sarah asked, though she suspected the answer. "Too early to say definitively, but given the lack of skeletal trauma and the positioning, I'd look at asphyxiation, poisoning, or possibly exposure. The room is unheated. On Christmas Eve 1989, temperatures dropped below 0. If they were left here alive and restrained, hypothermia could have killed them within hours." Raymond joined them, his expression grim. "I've been going through the original case file. The last confirmed sighting was security footage showing them leaving through the employee exit at 10:31 p.m. The car was discovered at 11:47 p.m. That gives us a 76-minute window." "Long enough to get them from the parking lot to this hangar," Sarah said, mentally mapping the distance. especially if the perpetrator had a vehicle and a way to incapacitate them quickly. The original investigation focused on the possibility of abduction by someone outside the airport, Raymond continued. But if they ended up here, inside an airport facility, that changes everything. This was someone with access, someone who knew the layout, someone who worked here. Sarah turned to look back at the hangar's vast interior. Through the opening in the wall, she could see the abandoned tarmac stretching away into the darkness, old runway lights standing like sentinels over a ghost airport. 35 years ago, this place had been alive with activity. Planes landing and taking off, ground crews working around the clock, maintenance personnel moving between hangars. "We need to pull employment records," she said. "Everyone who worked at Stapleton Airport in December 1989, particularly anyone with access to this hangar. Maintenance crews, security, management." "That's thousands of names," Raymond pointed out. "And most of the records were archived when the airport closed. Some might have been lost entirely. Then we start with what we have. The families deserve answers. Those women deserve justice, even if it's 35 years late." Dr. Vance cleared her throat. "There's something else you should see." She led them back to the doorway, pointing to the center of the circle formed by the 4 chairs. "We found this on the floor between them." Sarah directed her flashlight where Patricia indicated. In the dust and debris lay a small object that the evidence team had carefully marked but not yet removed. It was a cassette tape, the plastic case cracked with age, the label handwritten in faded ink. "Can you read what it says?" Sarah asked. Patricia nodded grimly. "It says Christmas Angels." A cold sensation crept down Sarah's spine. The positioning of the bodies, the deliberate staging, the tape left at the center. This wasn't just murder. This was ritual. This was someone who had wanted to create a tableau, a perverted memorial to his victims. "We need to check that tape," Raymond said. "Could be evidence on it. Voice recording, music, something the killer wanted them to hear." "I'll have the lab examine it," Patricia confirmed. "Though after 35 years in these conditions, there's no guarantee anything on it will be playable." Sarah stepped back from the doorway, her mind racing through possibilities. Serial killers often kept trophies or created elaborate scenes. The theatrical nature of this crime suggested someone with a deep psychological need for control and display. But to keep the scene hidden for 35 years also required patience and careful planning. "The killer had to know this hangar would eventually be torn down," she said, thinking aloud. "He had to know they'd be found eventually." "Unless he died first," Raymond suggested. "Or maybe that was part of the plan. Create his masterpiece and let time reveal it." The evidence team began the delicate process of removing the remains. Each skeleton would be carefully transported to the medical examiner's office for detailed analysis. The chairs, the wire, the shoes, the tape. Everything would be cataloged and studied for trace evidence that might have survived the decades. Sarah watched as the first skeleton was lifted from its chair, the bones carefully supported to prevent damage. Somewhere, a family had spent 35 Christmases wondering what had happened to their daughter, their sister, their mother. The discovery of these remains would bring some closure, but it would also reopen wounds that had never fully healed. Her phone buzzed. The department's public information officer had already fielded calls from local news stations. Word of a major discovery at the old Stapleton site was spreading. By morning, this would be headline news across the state. "We need to notify the families before this hits the media," Sarah said. "They deserve to hear it from us first." Raymond nodded, pulling out his own phone. "I'll start making calls. I remember some of the family members from the original investigation. Jennifer Parcells' mother, Diane Rothman's fiancé, though he's probably moved on by now." As the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, Sarah stood in the hangar doorway, watching her team work. Somewhere in this city was a person who had murdered 4 women and hidden them in this room, who had arranged them in this circle and left them to die in the cold and dark. That person might be dead now, beyond the reach of justice, or they might still be alive, watching the news, knowing that their secret had finally been revealed. Either way, Sarah was determined to uncover the truth. The Christmas Angels, as the killer had so grotesquely named them, would finally have their story told. The notification process began at 7 in the morning. Sarah had insisted on handling them personally rather than delegating to victim advocates, despite the emotional toll. These families had waited 35 years for answers. They deserved to hear the news from the detective leading the investigation. Jennifer Parcells' mother, Dorothy, still lived in the same house in Lakewood where she had raised her daughter. She was 68 now, her hair completely white, her hands marked with arthritis. When she opened the door and saw Sarah's badge, her face went pale. "You found her," Dorothy said. "Not a question. We found remains at the old Stapleton Airport site that we believe may be Jennifer's," Sarah confirmed gently. "We'll need dental records to make a positive identification." Dorothy led her into a living room that had become a shrine. Photographs of Jennifer covered every surface: graduation pictures, wedding photos, snapshots of her with her 2 children. The children were grown now, in their 40s, with families of their own. They had been 4 and 6 when their mother disappeared. "I always knew she didn't leave on her own," Dorothy said, settling into an armchair. "Jennifer would never abandon her babies, never. But the not knowing, the hoping maybe she was alive somewhere, even if she couldn't come home." Her voice broke. It was torture. Sarah explained what they had found, leaving out the more disturbing details about the positioning and the wire bindings. There would be time for those revelations later, in official reports and court proceedings if they identified a suspect. For now, Dorothy needed only the essential facts. "Were the others there too?" Dorothy asked. "Diane, Kelly, Stacy." "We believe so. 4 sets of remains, all female, consistent with the missing flight attendants." Dorothy closed her eyes. "Their families need to know. We stayed in touch, you know. For years we met every Christmas Eve, held vigils, kept the case in the public eye. But people drift apart. Pain either binds you together or drives you apart, and we all grieve differently. I'll be contacting them today," Sarah assured her. "Do you remember anything from that time? Anything the original investigators might have missed? Anyone who seemed too interested in the case? Anyone who worked at the airport?" Dorothy considered this carefully. "There was a man. I don't remember his name, but he worked airport security. He came to the first vigil, said he wanted to help. He seemed very affected by Jennifer's disappearance, said he had a daughter the same age. But then we never saw him again." Sarah made a note. "What did he look like?" "Average height, dark hair going gray, glasses, very polite, very soft-spoken." Dorothy frowned. "I remember thinking it was odd that he came in uniform, like he wanted us to know he worked at the airport." It was a slim lead, but Sarah had worked cases that broke on less. She spent another 30 minutes with Dorothy, gathering details about Jennifer's life, her work schedule, her relationships with the other flight attendants. By the time Sarah left, arrangements had been made to obtain Jennifer's dental records from her longtime dentist. The next notification was more difficult. Diane Rothman's fiancé, Michael Torres, had remarried 12 years after her disappearance. He lived in Boulder now, working as an architect, with 2 teenage daughters and a wife who knew about his past but had never met the woman who haunted it. When Sarah called to arrange a meeting, Michael's voice went quiet. "You found her." They met at a coffee shop near his office. Michael was 54 now, his dark hair streaked with gray, his eyes holding the wariness of someone who had learned not to hope too hard. He listened as Sarah explained the discovery, his coffee growing cold between his hands. "I kept her ring," he said quietly. "The engagement ring. My wife knows. She understands. I couldn't let it go, couldn't sell it or give it away. It felt like giving up on Diane, even though I knew she was gone." He looked up at Sarah. "I'll give you her dental records. Her parents moved to Arizona after the first year. They couldn't stay in Denver, couldn't live with the constant reminders. I'll contact them." "Did Diane ever mention feeling unsafe at work? Anyone who made her uncomfortable? Any incidents on flights or at the airport?" Michael shook his head. She loved her job. Said the other attendants on her regular routes were like family. Jennifer, Kelly, Stacy, they worked together several times a month. Diane mentioned them often, talked about going out after flights, celebrating birthdays. His hands tightened around the coffee cup. The four of them, they were friends. That's what made it so hard to understand. How could four women just vanish together? How could no one see anything? Someone saw, Sarah said. Someone knew, and we're going to find out who. Kelly Ashford's parents had both passed away, her father from a heart attack in 1995, her mother from cancer in 2003. Her younger brother Nathan was the only immediate family remaining. He agreed to meet Sarah at his apartment in Capitol Hill. Nathan was 45, a software engineer who had never married. Photographs of Kelly covered one wall of his living room, a memorial he had maintained for decades. He stood in front of them as Sarah delivered the news, his shoulders rigid. "The not knowing was worse than knowing she's dead," he said finally. "Does that make me a terrible person? But at least now we can bury her. Give her a proper funeral. Let her rest." He turned to face Sarah, and she saw tears on his cheeks. Kelly was the fun one in our family. She was always laughing, always planning the next adventure. She wanted to see the world, and being a flight attendant let her do that. She sent postcards from every city, filled our house with stories about passengers and layovers and crew shenanigans. He wiped at his eyes. After she disappeared, the house got so quiet. My parents never recovered. They died still hoping she'd walk through the door. Sarah gave him time, then asked the same questions about suspicious individuals or concerning incidents. Nathan remembered Kelly mentioning a passenger who had made her uncomfortable on a flight from Phoenix. An older man who had watched her throughout the service and tried to follow her into the crew area. But that had been months before her disappearance, and Kelly had filed a report with the airline. "I'll need to see that report," Sarah said. "Do you know if your parents kept any of Kelly's work documents?" "Everything's in storage. I couldn't throw it away. I'll send you the address." The final notification was the most challenging. Stacy Morrison had been estranged from her family at the time of her disappearance. Her parents had not approved of her lifestyle, her career choice, or her decision to move to Denver. When she vanished, they had declined to participate in searches or vigils, maintaining that Stacy had made her choices and would have to live with the consequences. Stacy's sister, Rebecca, had broken from the family over their callousness. She lived in Fort Collins now, teaching high school English. When Sarah reached her by phone, Rebecca's response was immediate. "I'll drive down this afternoon. I want to see where she was found." They met at the hangar site at 3 o'clock. The area was still cordoned off, but Sarah escorted Rebecca through the security perimeter. Rebecca stood at the entrance to the small room where the remains had been discovered, staring at the empty space. "She was alone so much in life," Rebecca said. "At least at the end, she had friends with her." "You stayed in touch with Stacy?" Sarah asked. "When I could. Our parents forbade contact, but Stacy would call me sometimes, late at night. We'd talk for hours." Rebecca's voice wavered. "The last time we spoke was 3 days before Christmas. She said she was working a flight on Christmas Eve, but would call me on Christmas Day. She never did." "Did she mention anything unusual? Anyone bothering her?" Rebecca hesitated, then nodded slowly. "There was someone. She didn't give me a name, said she wasn't sure if it was anything, but one of the maintenance workers at Stapleton had started showing up wherever she was. At her gate, in the crew areas, even outside the terminal when she was leaving. She thought he might have been following her." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Did she describe him?" "Quiet guy," she said. "Wore glasses. Always seemed to be watching her." Rebecca met Sarah's eyes. She said it creeped her out, but she didn't know if she was being paranoid. She'd had a stalker boyfriend in college, and it made her sensitive to that kind of attention. This matched Dorothy's description of the security guard who had attended the vigil. 2 separate accounts of a quiet man with glasses who had shown unusual interest in the case and the victims. Sarah felt the familiar tingle that came with a solid lead. "Thank you, Rebecca. This could be important." As the sun set over the abandoned airport, Sarah returned to her car and immediately called Raymond. He answered on the first ring. "I think we have our suspect profile," she said. "Airport employee, male, glasses, quiet demeanor. Accessed the vigil to insert himself into the investigation. Possibly stalked at least one of the victims before the abduction." "I'm at the archives now," Raymond replied. "Personnel records from Stapleton, December 1989. There's a lot to go through, but I'm narrowing it down to maintenance and security staff with access to Hangar 7. Focus on males fitting the description. And Raymond, look for anyone who left employment shortly after Christmas 1989. Our guy might have quit or been transferred to avoid suspicion." Sarah sat in her car, watching the crime scene tape flutter in the evening wind. Somewhere in those archives was a name, a file, a piece of paper that would lead them to the person who had murdered 4 innocent women and hidden them away like discarded dolls. The case was 35 years old, but the evidence was fresh, and the determination to find justice had never been stronger. Raymond's call came at midnight. Sarah had been lying awake in her apartment, her mind cycling through witness statements and timelines, unable to shut down despite her exhaustion. She grabbed her phone on the first ring. "I found him," Raymond said without preamble. "Daniel Kraus, age 54 in 1989. Worked aircraft maintenance at Stapleton for 16 years, assigned primarily to Hangar 7. Sarah sat up, fully alert now. "Tell me everything." Kraus was a mechanic, specialized in electrical systems, divorced, no children, lived alone in an apartment in Aurora. According to his employment file, he was considered a reliable worker, quiet, kept to himself, always volunteered for holiday shifts. Raymond paused. He called in sick on December 26, 1989. Never returned to work. Filed medical leave papers claiming he'd had a breakdown, needed psychiatric treatment. Where is he now? That's where it gets interesting. He disappeared from the system entirely after 1990. No tax returns, no employment records, no address changes. It's like he vanished. Sarah threw off her covers and reached for her clothes. "Social Security number." "I've got it. I'm running it now through every database we have access to. If he's alive and using that number, we'll find him." "I'm coming in. Start pulling everything we can find on this guy. Bank records, medical records, known associates. And Raymond, get a warrant for his last known address. If he left anything behind when he disappeared, I want to see it." Denver Police Headquarters was quiet at this hour, most detectives having gone home hours ago. Sarah found Raymond in the conference room they had commandeered for the investigation. The walls were covered with photos from the crime scene, timeline charts, and maps of the old Stapleton Airport layout. Raymond had added a new section, everything they had on Daniel Kraus. The employment photo showed a thin man with receding dark hair, thick-framed glasses, and an expression that managed to be both bland and unsettling. There was something in his eyes, a flatness that suggested someone who existed behind a carefully constructed mask. "His apartment building still exists," Raymond said, pointing to an address in Aurora. "It's gone Section 8, mostly low-income tenants now. The landlord from 1989 is dead, but the property management company might have records." Sarah studied the photo, committing Kraus's features to memory. "Any family? Anyone who might know where he went?" "Parents deceased, no siblings. The divorce records show his ex-wife moved to California in 1987, remarried, changed her name. I've got a line on her current contact information. Call her as soon as business hours open. She might have insight into his psychological state, his habits, places he might have gone." Sarah moved to the timeline chart. "He called in sick 2 days after Christmas. That's 48 hours after the murders. Time enough to realize what he'd done, to panic, to plan an escape, or time enough to enjoy what he'd done before disappearing." Raymond suggested darkly. "The staging, the circle arrangement, leaving that cassette tape. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was planned, deliberate. He might have stuck around just to see the investigation unfold." The crime scene photos showed the small room in harsh detail. Sarah studied the positioning again, looking for meaning in the arrangement. The 4 chairs faced inward, the women forced to look at each other in their final moments. What kind of person would create such a scene? "The cassette tape," she said suddenly. "Did the lab recover anything from it?" Raymond nodded and pulled out a report. They managed to salvage some of the tape itself. It's badly degraded, but the audio forensics team thinks they can restore at least portions of it. They're working on it now. Priority that. If there's audio on that tape, it could tell us exactly what happened in that room. Her phone buzzed with an incoming email. The medical examiner's preliminary report. Sarah opened it and felt her stomach tighten as she read. "Patricia found ligature marks on the vertebrae," she said, "consistent with wire garrots. They were strangled, Raymond, one by one, while the others watched." Raymond's face went gray. "Jesus Christ. The wire matches the safety wire used in aircraft maintenance. Same gauge, same composition. He used materials from his own workplace, things he had access to, things that wouldn't seem unusual if anyone saw him carrying them." Sarah continued reading. Time of death estimated between 11 p.m. December 24th and 3 a.m. December 25th, based on decomposition patterns and environmental factors. "He had them in that room for hours." "The cassette," Raymond said. "Maybe he recorded it. Maybe that's what's on the tape. His trophy, his memento of what he did to them." The thought made Sarah's skin crawl, but it fit the profile. Organized killers often kept souvenirs, created elaborate rituals around their crimes. If Krauss had recorded the murders, the tape would provide irrefutable evidence of his guilt. If they could find him. "I want a forensic accountant on his finances," Sarah said. "He had to support himself somehow after disappearing. Either he had money saved, or he's working under a different identity. Already requested, should have someone assigned by morning." Raymond checked his watch. "It's almost 2. We should get some sleep, start fresh in a few hours." Sarah knew he was right, but sleep felt impossible with adrenaline coursing through her veins. They were close now, closer than the original investigators had ever gotten. The discovery of the bodies had given them what the 1989 team never had: a crime scene, physical evidence, a suspect with means and opportunity. "Go home," she told Raymond. "I'm going to stay, review the files again. Sometimes you see things at 3 in the morning that you miss during the day." After Raymond left, Sarah sat alone in the conference room, surrounded by the ghosts of 4 murdered women. She pulled up their individual case files, reading through the witness statements and family interviews conducted 35 years ago. Jennifer Parcell, devoted mother, working to support her children after an amicable divorce. Diane Rothman, engaged to be married, excited about her future. Kelly Ashford, adventurous and outgoing, living her dream of seeing the world. Stacy Morrison, estranged from her family but close to her crew, finding belonging in the community she had chosen. 4 women with full lives ahead of them, cut short by a man who had decided they existed for his entertainment, his control, his dark fantasies. Sarah's phone buzzed again. An email from the audio forensics lab, marked urgent. She opened it and read the message twice to make sure she understood. The cassette tape had yielded audio, degraded, fragmentary, but unmistakable. They had isolated voices, identifiable words, sounds that painted a picture of what had happened in that room. The lab was cleaning up the recording now, removing noise and enhancing clarity. They would have a preliminary version ready by morning. Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out over the sleeping city. Somewhere out there, Daniel Krauss might be living a normal life, might have created a new identity, might believe he had gotten away with murder for 35 years. But his victims were speaking now, their voices preserved on that cassette tape, ready to tell the story he had thought would remain his secret forever. "We're coming for you," Sarah whispered to her reflection in the glass. "Wherever you are, whatever name you're using, we're going to find you." The conference room lights hummed quietly in the darkness. Sarah returned to the files, pulling out maps of the old airport, marking the route Krauss would have taken from the employee parking lot to Hangar 7. The distance was significant, at least a quarter mile. He would have needed transportation to move 4 incapacitated women that distance without being seen. She made a note to check vehicle registrations for Kraus in December 1989. If he had owned a van or truck, that would explain how he transported the victims. The original investigation had focused on the victim's car, but Kraus would have needed his own vehicle to complete the crime. Dawn was breaking over Denver when Sarah finally allowed herself to leave headquarters. She drove home through empty streets, her mind still processing information, building theories, constructing the case that would ultimately bring Daniel Kraus to justice. At home, she managed 3 hours of fitful sleep before her alarm pulled her back to consciousness. She showered, dressed, and was back at headquarters by 9, armed with coffee and renewed determination. Raymond was already there, looking as exhausted as she felt. The ex-wife called back, he said. Cynthia Marsh, living in San Diego now. She said she'd talk to us, but wanted it on record that she hasn't seen or heard from Daniel Kraus since their divorce was finalized in 1987. Set up a video call. I want to hear what she has to say about him. Already done. She can talk at noon our time. Raymond handed Sarah a file folder. Also, the forensic accountant found something. Kraus had a savings account with nearly $40,000 in it when he disappeared. The account was never closed, and over the years, interest accumulated. It now has close to $90,000. No withdrawals since December 1989. Sarah frowned. So he either had another source of money, or he's dead. That's what I'm thinking. He could have planned this for years, squirreled away cash under a different name, created a false identity to escape to, or... Raymond paused. Or whatever psychiatric breakdown he claimed was real, and he killed himself sometime after the murders. It was a possibility Sarah had considered. Some killers, after achieving their dark fantasies, found the reality didn't match the anticipation. The guilt or disappointment could drive them to suicide. If Kraus was dead, they might never get full answers, never get justice in a courtroom. Let's not assume he's dead until we have proof, Sarah said. Pull missing persons reports for adult males from 1990 onward. See if any unidentified bodies match his description, and check psychiatric facilities. If he really did have a breakdown, maybe he was institutionalized under his own name or an alias. Her computer pinged with a notification. The audio forensics lab had finished their preliminary restoration of the cassette tape. The file was available for review, though they warned that the content was extremely disturbing. Sarah hesitated only a moment before downloading the file and plugging in her headphones. She needed to hear what had happened in that room, needed to understand the full scope of what Daniel Kraus had done. The victims deserved to have their story told, even if that story was almost unbearable to hear. She pressed play, and the voices of the dead began to speak. The audio began with static, a crackling hiss that seemed to fill Sarah's headphones with the sound of time itself. Then, through the degradation and noise, a voice emerged. Male, calm, almost conversational. December 24th, 1989, 11:42 p.m. This is for posterity, so the world will understand what I've created here. Sarah felt ice settle in her stomach. He had recorded it deliberately, documented his crime like a nature photographer capturing some rare phenomenon. She forced herself to keep listening. 4 angels, chosen for their beauty and grace. They fly above us all, serving humanity with their smiles and their service. But tonight, they descend. Tonight, they join me in a different kind of flight. The voice paused, and Sarah could hear breathing in the background. Multiple people breathing. Rapid, panicked. The women were alive at this point, listening to their captor's monologue. They don't understand yet. They think this is about them, about something they did or didn't do. But it's not. It's about what they represent. Perfection, freedom, everything I can never have, never be. A whimpering sound filtered through the static. One of the women crying. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. Jennifer asks why. She keeps asking why. She has children at home, she says. They're waiting for her. But that's the point, Jennifer. Someone is always waiting, and sometimes The waiting never ends. Sarah paused the recording, needing a moment to steady herself. This wasn't just evidence. This was the soundtrack to four women's final hours, preserved by their killer as some twisted artistic statement. She forced herself to continue. I've arranged them in a circle, north, south, east, west. 4 points of a compass, 4 directions they'll never travel again. They can see each other, watch each other. That's important. Witnesses to the end. More sounds, muffled protests, the scrape of chair legs against concrete. Krauss was moving around the room, adjusting his tableau. Diane's engagement ring catches the light. She's been trying to bargain with it, offering me money, jewelry, anything. She doesn't understand that I don't want her possessions. I want her final moments. I want to preserve this instant when everything changes, when the mundane becomes eternal. The recording degraded into static for several seconds. When it cleared, Krauss's voice had changed, become more agitated. Kelly is crying. Her mascara runs down her face, ruins the composition. I've asked her to stop, but she won't listen. None of them listen. They scream into the gags, they struggle against the wire. Don't they understand this is beautiful? This is art? Sarah felt nausea rising. The clinical detachment in his voice, the way he described their terror as an aesthetic problem. It revealed a mind completely divorced from empathy, from any recognition of their humanity. Stacy is quiet. She watches me, studies me. I think she knows it doesn't matter what she says or does. She's accepted it. That's good. Acceptance is important. Resistance ruins the purity of the moment. A long pause filled with ambient sound. The wind outside the hangar, the distant hum of airport activity, the ragged breathing of terrified women. It's time. I'll start with Jennifer. The others will watch, will understand what's coming. That anticipation, that knowledge, it's crucial to the experience. They need to know, need to feel the weight of inevitability. Sarah stopped the recording again. She couldn't listen to the actual murders, not yet. She needed to brief Raymond first, needed to prepare the team for what this tape contained. But even these fragments were enough to confirm their worst suspicions about Daniel Krauss. He wasn't just a murderer. He was a sadist who had choreographed his crime like a performance, who had forced his victims to witness each other's deaths, who had recorded it all for his own future enjoyment, or perhaps as a legacy, a testament to his twisted vision of artistry. She removed her headphones and found Raymond standing in the doorway. His face told her he had seen her reaction, understood the gravity of what the tape contained. "That bad?" he asked quietly. "Worse. He recorded a manifesto, described the murders as art, as some kind of philosophical statement. He's completely delusional, completely detached from the reality of what he was doing." Raymond moved into the room, closing the door behind him. "I've got the background check on Krauss's employment history. Before Stapleton, he worked at 3 other airports over 15 years, Phoenix, Dallas, and briefly in Seattle. I've contacted police, departments in all 3 cities, asking them to review unsolved disappearances of young women during the periods he was employed there." Sarah felt a chill. You think there were others. 4 women murdered in such an elaborate, ritualized way. That level of planning, that kind of psychological detachment, it doesn't develop overnight. If Krauss did this, I'd bet my pension he'd done something before, maybe multiple times. It made horrible sense. Serial killers often refined their methods over time, escalating from fantasy to smaller crimes to finally acting out their darkest impulses. The sophistication of what Krauss had done to the flight attendants suggested experience, practice. Pull missing persons cases from all 3 cities. Focus on young women who disappeared near airports or had connections to airlines. Look for similar patterns. Multiple victims taken at once, elaborate staging, bodies hidden in airport facilities. Raymond nodded grimly. Already started. Phoenix PD is sending files on 3 unsolved cases from 1978 and 79. Young women, all employed by airlines, all disappeared within months of each other. Sarah's phone buzzed. The video call with Krauss's ex-wife was ready. She and Raymond moved to the conference room, where a laptop was set up for the conversation. The screen flickered to life, revealing a woman in her early 60s, her face lined with the kind of weariness that came from carrying difficult memories. "Mrs. Marsh, thank you for speaking with us," Sarah began. "I'm Detective Chen. This is Detective Cole. We're investigating a series of murders that occurred in Denver in 1989, and we believe your ex-husband, Daniel Kraus, may be involved." Cynthia Marsh's expression didn't change, as if she had been expecting this call for decades. "What do you want to know? Can you tell us about Daniel's mental state during your marriage? Any concerning behaviors, any indication he might be capable of violence?" Cynthia was silent for a long moment, her eyes distant. Daniel was always strange, not in obvious ways. He held down a job, paid the bills, seemed normal on the surface. But there was something off about him, something missing. He didn't connect with people, didn't seem to feel things the way others did. "Can you give us specific examples?" Raymond asked. "We had a dog, a golden retriever named Sam. Sweet dog, very friendly. One day I came home and found Sam dead in the garage. Daniel said he'd gotten into some rat poison, that it was an accident. But the vet who examined Sam's body said the poison had been administered deliberately, force-fed. When I confronted Daniel, he just looked at me with this blank expression and said the vet was mistaken." Sarah exchanged a glance with Raymond. Animal cruelty was a common precursor to violence against humans. "There were other things," Cynthia continued. "He would watch people, study them like they were specimens under a microscope. He took photographs constantly, had shoeboxes full of pictures of strangers, women mostly, at airports, on the street, through windows. When I asked him about it, he said he was studying composition, light and shadow. But the way he looked at those photos, the intensity, it frightened me." "Did he ever threaten you, become violent toward you?" "Not physically, but psychologically. He knew how to hurt without leaving marks. He would say things designed to make me doubt myself, question my sanity. He'd move my belongings and then deny doing it. He'd tell me elaborate stories about his day and then later claim he'd never said those things. By the time I left him, I was seeing a therapist twice a week just to maintain my grip on reality." "When was the last time you had contact with him?" Sarah asked. "The divorce was finalized in March 1987. I moved to California 2 weeks later. I never saw him again, never wanted to. I changed my name, started over, tried to forget those 5 years of my life." Cynthia leaned closer to the camera. "Did he kill someone?" 4 people, flight attendants, on Christmas Eve, 1989. Cynthia closed her eyes. Flight attendants. Of course. He was obsessed with them, said they represented something he could never achieve. Freedom, beauty, grace, all the things he felt were denied to him. He would watch them at the airport, photograph them without their knowledge. I told him it was creepy, but he said I didn't understand art. "Do you have any idea where he might have gone after 1989? Any family, friends, places he talked about?" Daniel didn't have friends. He had people he observed, people he studied, but no one he connected with. As for family, his parents died when he was young. He was raised by an aunt in Montana, but she passed away in the early 80s. There was no one else. "Montana," Sarah said. "Do you remember where in Montana?" "A small town, I think, near Glacier National Park. He talked about it sometimes, said it was the only place he'd ever felt peaceful. He had photographs of it, old pictures from his childhood. Mountains, forests, isolation." After the call ended, Sarah immediately pulled up a map of Montana. The area near Glacier National Park was vast and sparsely populated, full of small towns and remote properties. If Kraus had gone there, he could have disappeared into the wilderness, lived off the grid for decades. "I'll contact Montana State Police," Raymond said. "Have them check property records for Daniel Kraus or any variations. If he inherited land from his aunt, he might have gone there." Sarah was already typing a request into the national database for driver's licenses issued in Montana between 1990 and present, cross-referencing with Kraus's physical description and approximate age. It was a long shot. He could have assumed a completely different identity, altered his appearance, but they had to try every avenue. The afternoon brought a breakthrough. Montana State Police found a property record in the name of Daniel Krause, a small cabin on 50 acres near the town of Essex, inherited from his Aunt Marianne Krause in 1983. Property taxes had been paid every year, automatically deducted from an account set up before the aunt's death. "We need to go there," Sarah said. "If he's alive, if he's hiding, that cabin is where we'll find him." Raymond nodded. "I'll arrange a team, local law enforcement, tactical support. We'll move at first light tomorrow." As Sarah prepared for the operation, her phone rang. The number was unlabeled, local. She answered cautiously. "Detective Chen, this is Patricia Vance. I finished the full autopsies on all 4 victims. There's something you need to know." Sarah stepped away from the bustle of the department, finding a quiet corner. "What did you find?" "The strangulation wounds show a specific pattern. The killer used a technique that would have prolonged death, made it slower, more agonizing. He wasn't just killing them. He was savoring it, drawing it out." Patricia paused. "But here's what's really disturbing. The wounds on each victim are progressively more refined, more controlled. From the first victim to the last, you can see him perfecting his technique." "He practiced on them," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "He murdered them one by one, learning, improving." "Exactly. The first victim, based on the positioning, likely Jennifer Parcell, shows hesitation marks, multiple attempts to achieve the right pressure. By the 4th victim, the wounds are clean, precise, almost surgical. He'd mastered it." Sarah thanked Patricia and ended the call. She stood alone in the hallway, absorbing the full horror of what had happened in that room 35 years ago. 4 women forced to watch as their friend died, knowing they would be next, that each death brought them closer to their own. And through it all, Daniel Krause had been learning, refining, turning murder into an art form. Tomorrow they would fly to Montana. Tomorrow they would confront whatever waited in that cabin in the woods. But tonight, Sarah sat with the case files, committing every detail to memory, making a silent promise to Jennifer, Diane, Kelly, and Stacy that their killer would face justice, that their story would be told, that they would not be forgotten. The flight to Kalispell, Montana departed Denver at 6 a.m. Sarah and Raymond were accompanied by 4 tactical officers and 2 agents from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, who had been called in given the serial nature of the crimes. The small plane cut through heavy cloud cover, emerging into brilliant winter sunshine over the Rocky Mountains. Special Agent Laura Reeves reviewed the case file during the flight, her expression growing darker with each page. She was in her late 40s, a veteran profiler who had worked dozens of serial cases. When she finished reading, she looked up at Sarah with something approaching respect. "You built this case from skeletal remains and a degraded tape recording. That's impressive work." "We had help from the victims," Sarah said. "They left us breadcrumbs, the shoes, the positioning, the tape itself. Krause wanted this discovered eventually. He wanted his work to be seen." "Narcissistic personality with sadistic tendencies," Laura agreed. "The recording reveals grandiose delusions. He genuinely believed he was creating art. Men like this don't stop with one event. If he's alive, he's either killed again or he's been reliving this crime for 35 years, sustained by the memory." The second FBI agent, Marcus Webb, leaned forward. "The question is whether he'll surrender peacefully. He's had decades to prepare for this moment. He might view capture as the final act of his performance. Or he might have a suicide plan," Raymond added. "Some killers script their own endings, want to control the narrative all the way to the conclusion." Sarah had considered this possibility throughout the night. Krause might see their arrival as validation, the audience finally arriving to appreciate his masterpiece. Or he might see it as corruption of his art, the mundane world intruding on his private perfection. Either way, they needed to approach with extreme caution. They landed in Kalispell at 9:30. Local law enforcement met them at the airport, Sheriff Tom Bradford and 2 deputies who knew the terrain around Essex. Bradford was a weathered man in his 60s, skeptical of outsiders but cooperative when Sarah explained the case. "The Krause property is remote," he said, spreading a topographical map across the hood of his truck. "Access road is barely maintained, especially this time of year. Snow's been heavy. We'll need 4-wheel drive vehicles, and we should expect the approach to be slow." "Is the cabin visible from the road?" Laura asked. "No, it's set back about half a mile through heavy forest. There's a cleared area around the structure itself, but approaching unseen will be difficult if anyone's watching." They formed a convoy. 3 trucks carrying the tactical team, Sarah, Raymond, the FBI agents, and local law enforcement. The drive from Kalispell to Essex took 90 minutes through increasingly wild country. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks brilliant white against the sharp blue sky. Forests of pine and fir pressed close to the narrow highway. Essex itself was barely a town. A few scattered buildings serving the railroad that ran through the area and the occasional tourist heading to Glacier National Park. They stopped at a small general store to confirm their route and gather any local intelligence about the Krause property. The store's owner, an elderly woman named Martha, remembered the cabin. "No one's lived there full-time for years," she said, "though I've seen smoke from the chimney occasionally, usually in deep winter. Figured it was someone using it as a hunting cabin." "Have you ever seen the person?" Sarah asked. "Once or twice, at a distance. A man, think though I couldn't say for sure. Keeps to himself, doesn't come into town. We get a lot of folks up here who value their privacy." They continued north, eventually turning onto an unmarked dirt road that climbed into thick forest. Snow lay heavy under the trees, and the road was rutted with ice. The tactical team took the lead, their training evident in how they scanned the forest, looking for observation points or defensive positions. After 30 minutes of slow progress, Sheriff Bradford raised his hand, signaling a halt. "Cabin's about a quarter-mile ahead. We should proceed on foot from here." They parked the vehicles in a small clearing and continued on foot, moving quietly through the snow. The tactical team fanned out, establishing a perimeter while Sarah, Raymond, and the FBI agents approached the cabin's location with Bradford and his deputies. Through the trees, Sarah caught her first glimpse of the structure. It was small, built of weathered logs, with a stone chimney from which no smoke rose. A single window faced their approach, dark and unreflective. Snow covered the roof and surrounded the cabin in pristine drifts. No footprints led to or from the door. "Looks abandoned," Raymond whispered, but Sarah noticed details that suggested otherwise. The window glass was intact, not broken as it would be in a truly abandoned structure. The door hung straight on its hinges, and there, barely visible against the snow-covered porch, was a newer-looking padlock on the door. The tactical team leader, Sergeant Hayes, used hand signals to direct his officers into position. They approached from multiple angles, weapons ready, moving with practiced silence. Sarah and Raymond held back, waiting for the all-clear. Hayes reached the door first. He examined the padlock, then turned and shook his head. It was locked from the outside, suggesting no one was currently inside. He produced bolt cutters and severed the lock with a sharp snap that echoed through the forest. The door swung open into darkness. Hayes and his team entered first, flashlights mounted on their weapons cutting through the gloom. Sarah heard them clearing rooms. "Clear! Clear!" until Hayes appeared in the doorway and motioned them forward. "You need to see this," he said, his voice carefully controlled. Sarah and Raymond entered the cabin. The interior was a single large room with a sleeping loft accessible by ladder. A wood stove sat cold and empty. Simple furniture, a table, 2 chairs, a cot, occupied the space. But what dominated the room was the wall opposite the door. Every inch of it was covered with photographs. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, pinned and taped and glued in overlapping layers. All showed the same subject, the crime scene at Hangar 7, the 4 chairs arranged in their circle, the wire bindings, the skeletal remains in their eternal witness to each other. But these weren't crime scene photos from the recent discovery. These were older, showing the victims shortly after death, their bodies still intact, positioned exactly as they would remain for 35 years. Krauss had photographed his work, documented it from every angle, and then created this shrine to his achievement. Jesus Christ, Raymond breathed. Laura Reeves moved closer to the wall, studying the images with a profiler's detachment. He's been coming back here. Look at the layers. Newer photos on top of older ones. He's been adding to this display for decades. Sarah noticed other details. A journal lay open on the table, filled with handwritten entries. A cassette player sat beside it. Dozens of tapes scattered around it, each labeled with dates. Krauss hadn't just recorded the murders. He'd been recording his thoughts about them for 35 years. Marcus Webb picked up the journal carefully, using a gloved hand. The last entry is dated 3 days ago, December 14th, 2024. Sarah felt electricity run through her. He was here 3 days ago. He could still be in the area. Bradford immediately radioed his deputies to expand the search perimeter. The tactical team moved outside, looking for fresh tracks, any sign of recent presence. Sarah approached the table, reading over Marcus's shoulder. The entry was written in precise, controlled handwriting. December 14th, 2024, the news reports say they found them. My angels discovered at last. I've waited so long for this moment, this validation. Soon the world will see what I created, will understand the beauty of that Christmas Eve. But they won't understand fully, not without me to explain. I've decided. I will return to Denver. I will present myself to the investigators. I will tell them everything, show them everything. This is my legacy, my gift to the world. I leave tomorrow. Sarah looked up at Raymond, her mind racing. He's coming to us. He's going to turn himself in. Or he's planning something else, Laura warned. Narcissists like this, when they decide to reveal themselves, it's never simple surrender. He has an agenda, a final act he wants to perform. Raymond pulled out his phone, immediately calling Denver PD to alert them. They needed to increase security at the department, review anyone who had come in recently asking about the case, prepare for the possibility that Krauss might already be in the city. While Raymond coordinated with Denver, Sarah explored the rest of the cabin. The loft contained a sleeping bag and more journals, these ones dating back to the late 1980s. She picked up the oldest one, its cover worn and water-stained, and opened to the first page. January 3rd, 1990. I've done it. I've created perfection. The angels flew, and then they fell, and I was there to witness their descent. But now comes the difficult part, the waiting. The world isn't ready yet. They won't understand for years, maybe decades. So I will wait. I will preserve the memory. And when the time is right, I will reveal what I've done. Sarah photographed every page, every entry, building a psychological timeline of Krauss's decades in hiding. He had lived here intermittently, traveling to other locations. The journal mentioned Phoenix, Seattle, cities where Raymond was already investigating disappearances. Between these trips, he returned to the cabin to add to his shrine, to reinforce his delusions, to prepare for this eventual revelation. The most recent journals showed an evolution in his thinking. As the 35th anniversary of the murders approached, his entries became more focused on legacy, on how history would judge him, on the artistic merit of his work. He had convinced himself that enough time had passed, that the world would now be ready to appreciate what he had done. Detective Chen, Hayes called from outside. We found something. Sarah emerged from the cabin to find the tactical team gathered around a snow-covered mound about 50 yards into the forest. They had cleared away the snow to reveal a tarp, and beneath the tarp, a body. Male, approximately 70 years old, frozen solid. He wore hunting clothes and had been dead for perhaps a week, based on the preservation from the cold. His face was peaceful, almost serene, and in his frozen hand he clutched a photograph, one of the crime scene images from the cabin wall. Is it Krauss? Raymond asked, though Sarah suspected he already knew the answer. Laura knelt beside the body, studying the face, comparing it to the age-progressed images they had created from Krause's 1989 employment photo. It's him. He came here to see his shrine one last time, and then he walked out into the forest to die. Sheriff Bradford shook his head. Hypothermia would have taken him within hours in this cold, especially at his age. He laid down and let the winter take him. Sarah looked back at the cabin, at the wall covered with photographs of his victims. He said in the journal he was returning to Denver, that he wanted to tell his story. Why would he kill himself instead? Maybe he realized no one would understand, Laura suggested. Or maybe this was always how he planned to end it, on his terms, in his special place, surrounded by the only thing that mattered to him. Marcus bagged the photograph clutched in Krause's hand. It showed the 4 women in their circle, their faces still recognizable before decomposition had claimed them. On the back, written in Krause's precise handwriting, were their names and a final message. My Christmas angels, my perfect moment, preserved forever. I regret nothing. The news of Daniel Krause's death reached Denver by evening. Sarah stood in the conference room at headquarters, watching the coroner's van disappear down the mountain road through the window of Sheriff Bradford's office. They had spent the afternoon documenting everything in the cabin, collecting evidence that would close the case definitively, even though the perpetrator would never face trial. Raymond ended a call with the Denver Medical Examiner's office and turned to Sarah. Patricia wants us to bring back the cassette tapes from the cabin. She thinks comparing them to the one we found at the crime scene might reveal additional victims or crimes. Sarah nodded, her mind already working through the implications. The journals had mentioned other cities, other trips. If Krause had recorded those crimes too, the tapes might provide closure for families who had spent decades wondering what happened to their loved ones. We need to notify the victims' families, she said. They deserve to know we found him, even if there won't be a trial. The flight back to Denver departed at dusk. Sarah sat in silence, watching the mountains slip away beneath them as darkness fell. Beside her, Laura Reeves reviewed photographs of the cabin's interior on her tablet. I've seen a lot of killers' collections, Laura said quietly. Trophies, souvenirs, photographs. But I've never seen anything quite like this. The dedication, the obsession, he built a temple to his crime and tended it for 35 years. The journal entries, Sarah said. Did you read through all of them? Most of them. He was remarkably self-aware in some ways, completely delusional in others. He knew what he was doing was considered evil by society's standards, but he genuinely believed history would vindicate him, that someday people would see his crime as art rather than murder. Did he mention other victims? Laura was quiet for a moment. There are references to earlier compositions and practice pieces. Nothing specific, but enough to suggest the flight attendants weren't his first. The Phoenix PD cases from the late 70s are looking more and more like his work. Sarah pulled out her own tablet and opened the Phoenix files Raymond had obtained. 3 young women, all employed by airlines, all disappeared between November 1978 and March 1979. Their bodies were never found, and the cases had gone cold within a year. Krause worked at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport from 1977 to 1980, she said, checking his employment history. The disappearances coincide exactly with his time there. I'll have our team contact Phoenix PD, share what we found in the cabin. If Krause kept records of those crimes too, we might be able to give those families closure. The plane touched down at Denver International just after 9 p.m. A department vehicle waited to take them back to headquarters, where the media had already gathered, having gotten word of a major development in the Christmas Angels case. Sarah avoided the press conference, leaving that to the department's public information officer and the chief of police. Instead, she and Raymond returned to the conference room where the case had consumed their lives for the past week. The wall of photographs and timelines would come down soon, but for now, it stood as a testament to their investigation. I need to listen to the rest of the tape, Sarah said. The original one, from the crime scene. I stopped when it got to the actual murders, but we need to know everything on it. Raymond nodded. I'll listen with you. They sat together, headphones on, as the recording played through to its conclusion. The details were as horrific as Sarah had feared. Krauss narrating each death, describing the victim's reactions, the mechanics of strangulation, the satisfaction he derived from watching life leave their eyes while the others watched and waited. But at the very end, after all 4 women were dead, came something unexpected. Krauss's voice, different now, shaking, almost confused. "It's done. 4 angels fallen. But I don't feel what I thought I'd feel. The moment was perfect, exactly as I planned it. But now it's over and I'm alone with what I've done. The photographs will preserve it, the recordings will document it. But the moment itself is gone and can never be recaptured. Is this what I spent years planning for? This emptiness?" A long silence followed, filled only with ambient sound. Then, "I have to leave. I can't stay in this place, can't work here anymore, can't see the families on the news begging for information. I'll go to the cabin, to the mountains. I'll build something there to remember this, to hold on to it. Maybe in time, the significance will reveal itself. Maybe in time, I'll understand what I've created." The recording ended with a click, the cassette player shutting off. Sarah removed her headphones and sat in silence. Even at the moment of his greatest triumph, Krauss had felt the hollowness of his obsession. He had spent the next 35 years trying to convince himself that what he'd done had meaning, building his shrine in the wilderness, reinforcing his delusions with journals and photographs and recordings. "He died alone in the snow," Raymond said, "just like he lived, isolated, disconnected, unable to find whatever it was he thought murder would give him." "We should notify the families tomorrow," Sarah said. "Give them tonight, then tell them in the morning that we found their daughter's killer." They worked late into the night, preparing the official reports, documenting the evidence chain, building the case file that would close one of Denver's longest-running investigations. At midnight, Sarah finally left headquarters, exhausted and emotionally drained. At home, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat by the window, looking out at the city lights. 4 women had died on Christmas Eve 35 years ago, their lives ended by a man who saw them not as people, but as components in his twisted artistic vision. For decades, their families had lived with uncertainty, with hope that maybe somehow their daughters were alive somewhere. Now they had answers, but those answers brought no comfort. Jennifer, Diane, Kelly, and Stacy had died terrified and alone, forced to witness each other's murders, their final moments preserved on tape by their killer like specimens in a jar. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Raymond. "Just got word from Phoenix PD. They're reopening the 3 cold cases. Also found 2 more possibles from Seattle. The journals might solve cases across multiple states." She replied, "Good. Let's give every family we can some closure." The notification process began the next morning. Sarah insisted on handling them personally again, starting with Dorothy Parcell. The elderly woman sat in her living room, surrounded by photographs of Jennifer, as Sarah explained that they had found Daniel Krauss and confirmed he was responsible for her daughter's death. "Is he in custody?" Dorothy asked. "He's dead. We found him in Montana, at a cabin where he'd been hiding. He died of exposure to the elements about a week ago." Dorothy absorbed this information silently. Finally, she said, "So there won't be a trial? No chance to ask him why, to make him answer for what he did?" "No," Sarah admitted, "but we have extensive evidence. Recordings, journals, photographs. We know exactly what happened, and we can share as much or as little of that information as you want to know." "I want to know," Dorothy said firmly. "All of it. Jennifer deserves to have the truth told, even if it's painful." Sarah spent 2 hours with Dorothy, walking her through the investigation, the discovery of the bodies, the evidence at the cabin. She edited the worst details, the exact descriptions from Krauss's recording, the photographs on the cabin wall, but she didn't sugarcoat the basic facts. Jennifer had been murdered along with her 3 friends by a man who had stalked them, abducted them, and killed them for his own gratification. When Sarah finally left, Dorothy stood at the door. "Thank you, Detective, for not giving up, for finding them. Jennifer can rest now. We all can." The other notifications followed a similar pattern. Michael Torres, Diane's former fiancé, took the news stoically, asking only whether she had suffered. Nathan Ashford, Kelly's brother, broke down but expressed gratitude that his sister's remains could finally be properly buried. Rebecca Morrison, Stacy's sister, listened to everything with dry eyes, then asked if she could have one of Stacy's personal effects that had been recovered from the crime scene. By late afternoon, all 4 families had been notified. The media had the story now. The headlines screamed about the Christmas Angel's killer found dead, the cold case solved, the decades of mystery finally resolved. Sarah watched the news coverage from her office, feeling no satisfaction in the attention, only a profound sadness for lives cut short and families fractured by one man's delusions. Her phone rang. Patricia Vance. "Sarah, I've been reviewing the additional cassette tapes you brought back from Montana. There's something on one of them you need to hear." "What is it?" "It's dated December 25th, 1989, Christmas Day, about 18 hours after the murders. Krause recorded himself at the cabin, apparently during his first trip there after fleeing Denver." "Send it to me." The file arrived moments later. Sarah plugged in her headphones, bracing herself for more of Krause's disturbed ramblings. But this recording was different. His voice was ragged, almost broken. "I thought it would feel like creation, like bringing something new and beautiful into the world. But all I feel is empty. I keep replaying the moments in my mind, and they're already fading, already becoming less real than the photographs. I've destroyed 4 lives and gained nothing. The angels are gone, and I'm left with silence. The news says the families are searching, that police have no leads. Good. Let them search. Let them wonder. My secret is preserved here, in these mountains, and it will stay here until I decide otherwise. But the decision feels hollow now. Everything feels hollow. Maybe in time, this will change. Maybe the significance will reveal itself. Or maybe I've simply become what I always feared I was, a monster who killed for no reason, who destroyed beauty because I could never possess it myself." The recording ended. Sarah sat in the gathering darkness of her office, processing what she'd heard. In his final moments of clarity, before years of delusion rebuilt his self-justification, Krause had understood the truth of what he was. And then he had spent 35 years running from that understanding, building his shrine and his journals and his elaborate mythology to avoid confronting the reality that he had murdered 4 innocent women for absolutely nothing. A knock on her door pulled her from these thoughts. Raymond entered, carrying a file folder. The lab finished processing the evidence from the cabin. They found DNA on multiple items: clothing, personal effects, trophies Krause kept from other victims. They're running it through every missing persons database in the country. "How many potential matches?" 7 so far, spanning from 1977 to 1988. All young women, all with connections to aviation or airports. Raymond set the file on her desk. "We might be looking at a dozen or more victims across 3 decades. Sarah opened the file, scanning the preliminary reports. The scope of Krause's crimes was far larger than they had initially realized. The 4 flight attendants had been his masterpiece, his most elaborate crime. But they had been preceded by years of practice, of victims whose disappearances had gone unsolved and largely unnoticed. "We'll need to contact law enforcement in every jurisdiction where he worked," she said. "Reopen cold cases, compare evidence, give families closure wherever we can. I've already started. This is going to take months, maybe years, to fully unravel." Sarah looked at the photographs on her desk. Jennifer, Diane, Kelly, and Stacy, smiling in happier times. They had been the ones whose case broke open, whose discovery had finally revealed Krause's decades of evil. But they wouldn't be the last to receive justice. "Then we take however long it takes," she said. "Every victim deserves to be found. Every family deserves the truth." As night fell over Denver, Sarah stood at her office window, watching the city lights spread out below. Somewhere in that sprawl of streets and buildings were families who had lost daughters, sisters, mothers to Daniel Krause's obsession. Some of them knew it now, having received notifications from police departments reopening old cases. Others still waited, still wondered, still hoped against hope that their loved one might somehow still be alive. The Christmas angels had been found. Their story had been told. But the work of untangling all the threads of Daniel Krause's crimes had only just begun. Sarah returned to her desk and opened a new file. The first case from Phoenix, Sandra Matthews, age 23, disappeared November 17, 1978. Last seen leaving her shift as a ticket agent at Sky Harbor Airport. Never found. Until now. Sarah began to read, preparing to give Sandra's family the same closure she had given to Jennifer's, Diane's, Kelly's, and Stacy's. One case at a time, one victim at a time, one family at a time. Justice delayed was not justice denied. Not while there were detectives willing to chase the truth, no matter how long it took to find it. 6 months later, Sarah stood in a small cemetery in Lakewood on a warm June afternoon. 4 headstones had been placed in a row, each inscribed with a name, dates, and a simple phrase, "Together in flight, together in rest." The families had decided on a joint memorial service, recognizing that their daughters had been friends in life and had faced their final moments together. It seemed fitting that they be remembered together as well. Dorothy Parcell placed flowers at Jennifer's grave, her hands steadier now than they had been in December. Beside her, Jennifer's children, now adults with children of their own, stood in quiet contemplation of the grandmother they had barely known. Michael Torres had come from Boulder with his wife and daughters. He placed a single white rose at Diane's headstone, then stepped back to let Diane's elderly parents approach. They had flown in from Arizona, determined to finally lay their daughter to rest despite their advanced age. Nathan Ashford knelt at Kelly's grave, placing a photo of the two of them as children beside the flowers. He had taken a leave of absence from work to help with the funeral arrangements, throwing himself into the task with the dedication of someone who had waited 36 years for this moment. Rebecca Morrison stood alone at Stacy's grave, having outlasted her parents and the rest of a family that had refused to mourn Stacy properly. But she wasn't entirely alone. The other families had embraced her, recognizing that she had fought for Stacy's memory when no one else would. Sarah and Raymond stood at a respectful distance, present to honor the victims but not to intrude on the family's grief. They had attended the service earlier, listening as each family member shared memories of the women they had lost. Laughter had mixed with tears as stories emerged of Jennifer's terrible jokes, Diane's determination to plan the perfect wedding, Kelly's adventurous spirit, and Stacy's quiet kindness. The pastor concluded the service with a prayer, and slowly the gathering began to disperse. Dorothy approached Sarah as the crowd thinned. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything, for not giving up." "I wish we could have found them sooner," Sarah replied. 35 years is a long time to wait for answers, but having them now, being able to bury my daughter properly, to know what happened, it means everything." Dorothy glanced back at the grave. "She can rest now. We all can." As Dorothy rejoined her grandchildren, Raymond approached Sarah. "Phoenix confirmed another match. Sandra Matthews. DNA from a bracelet Krause kept in the cabin matches her dental records. Her family is being notified today." "How many does that make?" 11 confirmed victims spanning 12 years. There might be more, but those are the ones we can prove definitively. Raymond looked at the 4 graves. "But these 4, they're the ones who broke the case open. Without them being found, Krause's other victims might never have gotten justice." Sarah thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment. The demolition crew tearing down Hangar 7, the small room with its 4 chairs arranged in a circle, the blue handbag that matched the description from 36 years ago, the cassette tape with its horrifying recording, each piece of evidence a breadcrumb left by either the victims or their killer. leading investigators across decades to the truth. Detective Chen. A woman approached, younger, professional-looking. I'm Amanda Rothman, Diane's niece. I wanted to thank you personally for solving my aunt's case. My mother, Diane's sister, she died 5 years ago, still not knowing what happened. But I can tell her children about their aunt now, can tell them the truth. That matters. Sarah shook Amanda's hand. Your aunt and her friends were brave women. They deserved better than what happened to them. They did, but at least now their story is known. At least now they're remembered. As the cemetery emptied and the June sun climbed higher in the sky, Sarah walked along the row of graves one final time. She paused at each headstone, silently acknowledging Jennifer, Diane, Kelly, and Stacy, 4 women who had simply been doing their jobs on Christmas Eve in 1989, who had expected to go home to their families and friends, who had instead been chosen by a monster for his twisted vision of art. Their lives had been stolen, but their deaths had not been in vain. In revealing Krause's crimes, they had brought justice not only for themselves, but for at least 7 other women whose families had spent decades wondering. More cases were still being investigated, more connections being made. The full scope of Krause's evil might never be completely known, but every victim they identified, every family they could give closure to, was a victory against the darkness he had created. Sarah's phone buzzed. A message from the FBI. Another potential match had been found in Seattle, a flight attendant who had disappeared in 1981. They were requesting Denver PD's assistance in confirming the connection. She looked up at the clear blue sky, watching a plane trace a white contrail across the azure expanse. How many flights were in the air at this moment? How many flight attendants were serving passengers, offering smiles and professionalism, never imagining that danger might be watching from the ground? The world was full of predators, full of people who saw others as objects to be used and discarded. But it was also full of people like Dorothy and Michael and Nathan and Rebecca, people who refused to forget, who kept fighting for truth and justice no matter how many years passed. And it was full of people like Sarah and Raymond, who would chase leads across time and distance, who would piece together fragments of evidence until the story revealed itself, who would give voices to the silenced and faces to the forgotten. Sarah took one last look at the 4 graves, committing the image to memory. Then she turned and walked back to her car, already mentally preparing for the Seattle case, for the next family waiting for answers, for the next victim waiting to be found. The Christmas angels had found their rest at last. But there were others still waiting in the darkness, still calling out for someone to hear them, to find them, to bring them home. Sarah would not stop listening. She would not stop searching, not while there were still mysteries to solve, still questions to answer, still families waiting for the truth. The work continued. It always would. Above her, the contrails from passing aircraft sketched temporary messages across the sky, ephemeral lines that would fade with time but which, for a moment, were bright and clear and impossible to ignore. Just like the stories of the victims, just like the truth that refused to stay buried, just like justice, however long it took to arrive.